Hello everyone, I am Marc-Olivier Martin-Guay and this is a podcast about the paper Implications of Contrasted Above and Below Ground Biomass Responses in a Diversity Experiment with Trees that was published in Journal of Ecology. In many ecosystems, species composition and diversity are altered due to human influence, which can create novel ecosystems. Forest plantations are an obvious example of a novel ecosystem where we choose directly tree species composition and diversity. Even though it was found that many ecosystem functions are affected positively when tree diversity is increased, most forest plantations are still monocultures. The biodiversity-ecosystem functioning research tries to reveal how species interactions can lead to these positive effects of diversity. Many experiments were put in place to accomplish this research goal. The International Diversity Experiment Network with Trees, IDENT in short, has many experimental sites around the world, but we will be focusing on its oldest site in Montreal, Canada. This experiment uses 12 species that we find in North American temperate forests. In the spring of 2009, 12 monocultures, 14 two-species mixtures, and 10 four-species mixtures were established in 4 randomized blocks, resulting in 4 replicates for each mixture and each monoculture. This experiment was designed to rapidly obtain interaction between trees, so they were planted in dense 8x8 grid plots with 50 centimeter spacing between trees. After 4 growth seasons in the fall of 2012, 2 studies were conducted. In the first study, basal diameter and height were measured for each tree in the experiment. These stem dimensions were then used to estimate above-ground biomass for the inner 6x6 individuals of each plot. The second study took place during the same fall but was aimed at characterizing below-ground biomass. They used soil augers with a 7 cm diameter to extract soil cores. The roots were then extracted from these soil cores. They were washed, dried, and weighted. With these biomass estimations, it was possible to evaluate if mixtures perform better or worse compared to their respective monocultures. In other words, net effects were calculated. A net effect is the difference between observed biomass in a mixture and expected biomass based upon its corresponding monocultures. Expected biomass could be imagined as a plot with the same area as a mixture, but with juxtaposed monocultures instead. The first study that used stem dimensions found that tree diversity had on average a positive net effect on above-ground biomass. However, the second study found that tree diversity had on average a negative net effect on fine root biomass. These contrasted responses to diversity could be common in tree diversity experiments. Indeed, meta-analyses show that effects on above-ground biomass are positive overall, while effects on root biomass are neutral overall. These contrasted responses made us think of 3 different questions that we explored using the data from these 2 separate studies at the IDENT site in Montreal. Our first question was, does adding below-ground biomass change diversity effect estimations? This question is highly relevant considering the growing interest for carbon sequestration and forest management. Indeed, below-ground biomass can represent as much as 50% of biomass production for certain trees, and it cannot be ignored. In this figure, the y-axis is proportional deviation, which is the same as the net effect, but in relative terms. For example, proportional deviation of 0.1 means that the observed biomass in a mixture is 10% larger than what is expected from its corresponding monocultures. Comparing the first and last columns, we see that adding below-ground biomass does not change the estimation of diversity effects. However, effects on total biomass are smaller if we look only at the mixtures with positive effect above ground, represented by gray bars. These mixtures with positive effects will probably be the ones used by forest managers in diverse plantations. Our second question was, do species shift their biomass allocation strategies within mixtures? We know from pot experiments that seedlings can allocate more to above ground or below ground biomass depending on environmental conditions. This is called the optimal partitioning theory. For example, more water or soil nutrients will usually mean less allocation to below-ground biomass. Also, if there is less light, this will usually mean greater allocation to above-ground biomass. Species interaction within our mixtures could have created conditions leading to a shift in biomass allocation strategy. For example, it is possible that increased above-ground biomass within mixtures created more competition for light, thus creating a greater need for above-ground biomass. It is also possible that the different species use different ways to access below-ground resources. For example, species could have different rooting depth. In result, this could have reduced the need for allocation below ground. This differential use of resources is often called complementarity and is one of the most common hypotheses in the biodiversity-ecosystem functioning research. Since diversity effects were positive overall in our experiment, we thought that increased below-ground complementarity was a more probable explanation than increased above-ground competition. To verify if species shifted their allocation strategy, we looked at the net effect on the ratio between below and above ground biomass. The y-axis represents this net effect. Each column represents the average net effect for each mixture, with the overall average on the far right. We can see that there is no general shift in biomass allocation. However, seeing the variability in this net effect on biomass allocation, we can ask ourselves, are these shifts in biomass allocation strategies linked to positive effects on biomass? A correlation test reveals that this is not the case. We can also ask ourselves, do we interpret correctly the origins of these diversity effects when ignoring below-ground biomass? Indeed, many diversity mechanisms could enhance resource acquisition, such as above or below-ground complementarity. This will increase carbon fixation for the tree community, and then these surpluses in carbon will be allocated to both above and below ground biomass. Hence, we think that using the total biomass is more appropriate when trying to reveal these underlying mechanisms. One of the most widely used methods to reveal the origins of diversity effects is the partitioning method by Leroux and Hector. The original paper showing the method has been cited more than 1,000 times. Basically, it decomposes the net effect into two parts, the complementarity effect and the selection effect. This method uses the performances of each species within the mixtures and the monocultures to evaluate which effect is important. Let's take an example where there is a high-yielding broadleaf species and a low-yielding coniferous species. If these two species are mixed and show a positive net effect, the origins of this positive effect can be numerous. If both species benefit equally from being within the mixture, then we assume that this positive effect is mainly associated with complementarity mechanisms and positive interactions. If the high-yielding species is the only one benefiting from being within the mixture, while the low-yielding species has a decrease in growth, this means that the positive net effect is mainly associated with the dominance of the high-yielding species. We call this a selection effect. Finally, it is also possible for both complementarity and selection effects to play a role. In link with this widely used method, we can be more precise in the formulation of our third question and ask, does adding below-ground biomass change the conclusions obtained with the Leroux and Hector method? Here is a figure of the complementary effects on above-ground biomass on the x-axis and complementarity effects on below-ground biomass on the y-axis. The points being around the red line, we cannot conclude that adding below-ground biomass will affect the estimations of complementarity effects. On the other hand, selection effects on below-ground biomass are smaller than expected. This means that selection effects estimation using only above-ground biomass will be overestimated. In conclusion, we found two main implications to these contrasted above and below-ground responses. Our first discovery was that our quantification of diversity effects are larger when using only above-ground biomass. Mixtures showing positive effects add on average 30% more above-ground biomass than expected from their respective monocultures. When we use both above and below-ground biomass, this number was reduced to 22%. Clearly, people interested solely in stem biomass are not concerned by this result. However, when carbon sequestration is the goal, we should definitively consider below-ground biomass. Secondly, we found that the origins of these positive net effects could be slightly different. The method by Leroux and Hector is probably one of the most used methods to reveal the origins of diversity effects. Adding below-ground biomass to this method revealed that dominant species are less important than earlier thought, and positive interactions such as complementarity and resource acquisition could be more important. Finally, these results could be relevant in many settings considering that meta-analyses show a positive above-ground response to diversity overall, while the below-ground responses are neutral overall. Thank you for listening.